Tonight's bedtime story is the story that troubadours used to tell before the time of the Enlightenment. The story is the Handless Maiden. Once there was this mill inside of a kingdom, and inside the mill was an old man who owned the mill, and there was a family that lived with him. And he'd been there a long time, and the husband of the family that lived with him had worked for him for a long time, and they were almost like kin. And when the old man saw that the young man was going to get married, he propositioned him, "Please don't leave. There's room in my home for your family. You can live here." And the young man was very happy with that. The young man's name was Alex. And so Alex got his new wife, Alicia, and they moved in together, and they made a family. They were happy, they were working together, and the old man was happy because he had family around, and he really didn't have any family. So this went on, and the man started getting older, and he was concerned with what would happen to the mill when he passed, because he didn't have anybody to leave it to, and it would leave this family kind of out. And he really cared for them like they were his kin. So he came to the young serf that was working for him and his family, and he sat down with them at their table, as was customary for them, and he said, "Alex, would you take over the mill when I pass, and in the interim, take care of me as I age?" And Alex was taken aback. This was just such a huge gift. He would never expect to own any property. Serfs were poor and they never had property. And he never dreamed of having property. So he was elated and he said, "Yes, of course, Bob." Bob was the older man. And Bob was delighted too, because he would have caring hands helping him. And when he passed, the mill would stay in the hands of the people that he loved. So this went on, and the old man got tired and eventually transitioned into the ground, and Alex took over the mill. And Bob had counseled him because he knew Alex wasn't familiar with handling money, and he told Alex, "You've got to keep a little set aside if something breaks on the mill, that you got money to repair the mill, because if the mill's not running, you run out of money." So Alex was like, yeah, that sounds like good advice. And so the old man passed, and Alex starts trying to make his way into the bourgeois community, the more affluent and rich community than he was born into. And they were resistant to have Alex amongst him because he was a poor serf, and he really doesn't mix with us. And so Alex was trying hard to impress. He was spending money on fancy clothes and going to the gambling tables and losing money to make them happy. And they pretended they were happy because they were like taking his money, and but around his back and whispering, they really made fun of him, and there was no place for him there. Well, Alex didn't remain mindful to what Bob told him about being careful with the money, and the money dwindled away, and there was hardly any left. And a major break in the mill happened, and he didn't have the money to fix it. And the thing that Bob had warned Alex about had happened. The tragedy. He had been carefree and not careful with his money, and the mill was broken, and he was desperate, because if he didn't get the mill going, he wouldn't have money, and he would get in debt, and then the debt collectors would take the mill from him, and his family would be out in poverty, living in the mud with the rest of the unwashed masses. So Alex was desperate. He's going to all of his gambling buddies, beseeching them for a loan. None of them were going to have it. They didn't even care for him, let alone risk their money for him. And so he was getting desperate. And one dark, rainy night, he was walking back from meeting somebody in the forest. He was walking through the forest on a dark road, and a dark figure approached him, and it was kind of a threatening, menacing, evil kind of character. And Alex was a little alarmed, but the character didn't seem to have a threatening posture, just kind of a feeling about it that it wasn't right. And the character came up to him and said, "Hi, Alex." And he was surprised. This thing knows my name. And he said, I understand your mill's broken. And he was like, yeah, he was. He was desperate to have conversation. So he looked past the menacing exterior of this entity, and the entity said, well, you know what, Alex? I have powers, and I can fix your mill. It'll work again, and you don't have to spend any money on it. And Alex was like, really? You know how to do that? And the entity said, why, yes, I do. And he said, I just want one small thing from you. And it may seem a little strange, but it's a small price. And your family will be happy, you will be saved, everybody alive, and everybody will be happy. I just want the hands of your daughter. And Alex was like, the what? You want the hands of my daughter? What are you going to do with the hands of my daughter? He said, I will not explain that to you. I just require the hands of your daughter. And I will make your mill whole again. She will be healthy. It won't hurt her. She won't even feel me taking the hands. And your mill will be working again. And you won't be in debt. And you can recover from this. You can do this, Alex. And Alex was convinced this was the best thing to do. So he said, okay, I agree. And they signed up a contract right there. And the dark character walked into the forest, and Alex moved down the path towards his mill. And when he got to his mill, he discovered it was running, and it was working, and he was elated. And he went inside, and his wife was ecstatic, and his son was ecstatic. And they're joyous, and they're dancing around in the dining room area, eating, drinking. And then he noticed, where's my daughter? Oh, yeah, I better go check on her. So he goes into her room, and she's in her bed, and she's sobbing. She's like uncontrollably sobbing. And he said, Linda, what happened, Linda? And are you okay? Are you hurt? She's like, I'm not hurting, but look. And she put her hands up, and she had no hands. It was like this, like her hands had disappeared, and she was terrified. And he said, and it doesn't hurt? And he's like, no. And he said, I'm sorry, but I have to tell you, I did something, and it saved the family, and I know you're disappointed that you don't have hands, but look, we have income, we have stability, we've been saved. And she's like, yeah, but I don't have any hands. And he said, yes, but you'll get better, don't worry about it too much. And he consoles her a little bit, but mostly just brushes her feelings aside and doesn't acknowledge that she's sad. And he's so joyous that he just rushes out insensitively and leaves her crying in the room. And time goes on, and she gets, Linda gets a little more used to having no hands, walking around, picking things up in certain ways. And they hire a servant to help her out. And she gets out of her deep, deep depression that she initially had. And she's kind of in a sad, melancholy kind of mood. And so she becomes envious of the servant who's doing all of her work. She wants to do work. She wants to participate in things. And there's nothing for her to do around the house. So to kind of cure her melancholy mood, she goes out into the forest during the day and communes with the birds and the trees and finds pleasure in walking in the forest. And she still has moments of despair, and she'll get down on her knees and cry. But she's kind of finding her place. She's happy sometimes, and she's really sad sometimes. Well, one time during one of these really sad phases, she was in a meadow, prone, laying down like a child would, with his face down, crying into the grass. And the king rode by, and he was out hunting, and he noticed Linda crying. So he rode over, and then he noticed her beauty, because Linda was a radiant, beautiful young lady. And he, being in his prime and in his powers, about 40, I would say, was very attracted to her. She was so beautiful, he wanted to proclaim his beauty to her, take her home to his castle, and make her his queen. So he rode over, and Linda was startled to see a man approaching her on a horse. So she sat up, and she put her hands inside her coat to hide her hands. And the king came over, and the king said, you are radiant, young maiden. Your hair is like the heaven. your eyes are like the ocean. And he just goes on and on and on, expressing his adulation and love and admiration for her. And she's a little happier. And then she moves her arms, and she notices her hands like that, not there. And she thinks, this is not going to last. As soon as he sees me without any hands, he's going to see me ugly. And she despaired, and she yanked her hands out, and she said, see this? How can you love this? This is hideous. And he said, I don't see hideous. I don't see the missing hands. I can build you silver hands that replace your hands. And they will be beautiful, you will be radiant, and you can be my queen. And she thinks about it, and she thinks about the idea of having beautiful hands again. So she allows herself to be taken to the castle and made the queen. And in the court, she's kind of treated like, the court is like the king's meeting places where the really powerful people come, the king's level, not the lower down where her dad was, in that system. And she's not acceptable. Everybody kind of looks at this peasant bride that the king took, and they're like, what is he doing? Marrying outside of his class. So she really wasn't accepted, though they didn't say anything overtly to her face. There was certainly whisperings, and she could tell that her place wasn't among these people. So she again found herself lonely. She did have the companion at night of her king, but with the silver hands, she still couldn't serve her king, so she felt still largely void and not of much value. But the king adored her, and at night he treated her with tenderness and love, and in a couple weeks, she became pregnant with a baby, and she was elated. I have a child growing in me. And the king was happy too. And as is the case, 9 months later, the baby was born, and it was a young boy named Charlie, and Charlie was beautiful. He cooed, he laughed, he rarely cried, and they had put pillows in the queen's throne so she could prop up the baby, because with her silver hands she couldn't hold it, and nurse the baby and look at the baby. And while she did, she wanted to touch the baby's cheek, but with these cold metal hands she couldn't touch the cheek. And she wanted to hold little soft fingers, and she couldn't hold the soft little fingers. And she wanted to caress the bottom of its feet and touch it all over, and she couldn't touch it anywhere, and it was miserable for her. So she started to fall into another pit of black valley and despair. And in the meantime, before this happened, the king was joyous that he had a new son. So he had traveled off into foreign lands, into battle, to win new lands and new power for his new son. So he was away while the queen was falling into despair. And the king's mother was watching, and she was worried because the despair was getting darker and darker, and longer bouts of crying and weeping and wailing uncontrollably. And it wasn't having a good effect on the baby and the milk. It wasn't sweet, and the baby was crying, and everything was kind of falling apart. So the mother decided to send a note to the king to say, you need to come back here. Your wife is suffering, and you need to be here by her side and take care of this baby. I'm trying the best I can, and she's your wife. So she sent a messenger out with the message, and it was a long trip through the forest. It was a 2-day trip, and in the evening of his first day, when he was sleeping in the forest with his horse, this dark, sinister figure that had approached the mill owner, Alex, snuck up on the sleeping messenger and grabbed the message container, pulled the message out, and substituted a new one and closed it, placed it there, and the messenger didn't know the message had been swapped. So the messenger gets up, delivers the message, and the king opens the message and he reads it. And it says, the queen has gone crazy. She's trying to kill your baby. What should we do? And he's furious. How dare this little girl kill his prince, kill his prized possession? So he orders her executed. And he sends a message back to the mother to say to have her executed. And so the mother gets the message and she reads it and she's appalled. She's like, what the heck is wrong with my son? I told her that she's depressed. Why does he want to kill the queen? I can't deliver this message. I can't deliver this edict. So she goes over and she tells the queen that the king wants her dead, that there's an edict and a note commanding it, and that she should flee. And the queen is devastated. She's already depressed. And Linda's like, what did I do to deserve this? And the mother was, I don't know. I just told him that you were depressed. And she's like, why did you say anything? And she said, I was just trying to help. I don't know. My son is crazy. I don't know what he's doing. And so the queen is desperate because she can't carry her child off in her silver hands. And she can't stay because she will die. So in her desperation, she flees in the middle of the night. She doesn't even grab a coat. She's running in her dress down the road into the forest, and she starts running through the forest. And the snags and the thorns are catching her dress, and they're tearing her dress up and putting small little cuts on her arms, and it's just really tragic. And she continues on into the forest in this desperate phase to just get away. And she's wet. It's been a couple days. She's not found anybody. She's in the depths of the forest alone. She's hungry. She hasn't had water. And she's not doing well. Her health is suffering. She doesn't know how much longer she can go on before she falls from exhaustion. And she knows if that happens, she'll perish in the forest. And she'll die anyhow. So she's stumbling along, and it stops raining, and she comes up over this hill and over the other side of the hill and looks down, and there's a meadow, and the sun is shining, and it looks beautiful, and she yearns for it. So she works her way with the last of her energy out to the meadow, and she goes out with the idea that I will lay down in the sun. And as she's walking out in the meadow, she sees a cabin. And at first she thinks she's hallucinating because she's so out of it. She hasn't had food, she hasn't had water, and she's seeing things that aren't there. But yet she still stumbles towards it. And outside the cabin is this woodsman who is cutting wood with an axe. Chop, chop. And he looks up and he sees this disheveled, dirty, wet, cold, frail, about to fall down maiden, Linda, and he runs rushing out to her and catches her as she falls into his arms. And he gently picks her up, walks her to his cabin, cleans her dirty arms and legs and hair, and mends her gown and tucks her into his feathered bed and puts a heavy quilt over her to comfort her, and she sleeps. She sleeps for 3 days. And he tries to make some soup and give her a little soup because she needs sustenance. And even in her dream such state, she's so hungry that she's able to sit down the soup and take down some soup. So gradually she started getting a little better, and she woke up and she looked around and she says, where am I? And the woodsman, John, said, you're in my cabin in the woods. You came stumbling into the meadow, and you were in a terrible state. So I caught you, I cleaned you up, and I helped nurture you back to life. And he said, what happened to you, young lady? And she looked up and she realized what had happened. She remembered where she came from, that her child was still back in the kingdom, and she was alone, and she looks at her hands and she starts weeping. And she said, and she tells her sad tale, from losing her hands to marrying to coming here. And the woodsman is devastated. He's like, how could anybody treat such a lovely young person like you like that? He said, I can understand why you wouldn't want to go back. I'm not sure where you're going to go. And if you want, you can stay here with me and you can be like a family with me. And she said, really? You would let me stay with you? And it seemed too good to be true. And John was like, yes, really. You don't need to give me anything. I'm just kind of lonely out here. If you could just be like my sister and my friend, that's all I would really ever need. She said, that sounds wonderful. So they made an agreement right then and there that Linda and John would make a friendship and work together. And they did. And in the limited capacity that Linda could with her silver hand, she helped out. And they grew to be very tender and dear with each other. And John had done the respectful things that a friend would do, some friends, and he took the bed in the couch, which wasn't very comfortable. It didn't have much of a cushion. It was uncomfortable. And she would hear him turning and tossing at night. And Linda was lonely. She really wanted companionship and somebody to hold her. So she said to John one night at dinner, John, would you do me a favor? And she said, what is it, Linda? I would do anything for you. She said, would you cuddle with me tonight? And just hold me, nothing more. I just want you to hold me. And so John said, certainly, I will just hold you and comfort you. And so they ate their dinner, they did their nightly routine, and John got into bed with Linda, and they cuddled, and they fell off to sleep. They fell off to sleep and they were slumbering. And they had one of the most peaceful, dreamy nights without interruption. Neither one of them even stirred or moved. They just sat friends in embrace, hugging and loving each other. Well, Linda woke up in the morning and she sees John laying next to her asleep. He was snoring a little. And the sun's coming up, the birds are singing, and she's just in heaven. She's never felt better in her life. And it was in that moment that she looked at John when he was sleeping that she realized John cares for me selflessly. He doesn't want anything from me. He doesn't want to take anything from me. He doesn't want to treat me as an object and own me like a caged bird and put me in a cage. I really feel honored for who I am. And it was in that moment she realized she loved John. She loved John more than a brother. And she leaned forward and kissed John on the cheek. And John stirred and woke and asked her, what was that? And she was still holding him in her adoring gaze. And he's looking at her face and, are you okay? You know, what? So he noticed something different about her. He's like, are you okay? And she said, yes, in fact, I am fabulous. I have come to realize that I love you, John. And if you love me back, I would like to be more than a friend to you. And John was taken aback by it because he hadn't even thought about her loving him beyond being friends. And so he sat with it for a little while. He laid there and he thought about it. And they just laid there and thought about it. And he turned to her and he said, you know, Linda, I love you too. And I would love to be more than a friend to you. Would you marry me? And she cried with joy and wrapped her arms around him. And they held each other in not just friends embrace, but in a partnership, deep, intimate partnership embrace with a new understanding and contract that they would be lovers. And that morning, they made love to each other. They shared their affections, and the day was just a glistening, magical, like sticky, sweet honey the whole day. And they settled into these new roles as wood partners, and time went by, and Linda became pregnant again. She was going to have another baby. And John and Linda went to bed that night, and they were intimate, shared their love with each other, and they fell asleep. And a miraculous thing happened the next morning. Linda's hands grew back, And she was elated. How could this have happened? And she shakes John with her hands, and she can feel him for the first time with her hands. And she's so excited. And he's like, Linda, Linda, let me sleep. I'm tired. And then he notices that she's grabbing him with hands, and he looks over and he sees the hands that have grown back. And he's amazed. He said, what happened? She said, I don't know. What did you do? And he said, I didn't do anything. I don't know. It's a miracle. I don't understand it. And they both kind of pondered over it. They couldn't figure it out. I mean, the only thing that happened is John had loved her selflessly and honored her for the real woman that she was, and maybe that magic had something to do with her hands growing back. They didn't know. So they had a baby. It was a beautiful baby. And when the baby came along, the mother could, Linda could touch her baby, Sue, it was a little girl, baby Sue's cheeks, and hold it close and feel the warmth in her hands of this life that she's nurturing. And she caressed the bottom of Linda Sue's, Linda Sue, she went by Sue, her feet and her legs, and the little baby held her finger, and it was just joyous. She was in the most happiest time of her life. And John looked down on her, and he could see the love and the happiness, and he was happy for his wife as well. And they lived happily ever after. Now, the moral of this story is, the troubadours told the songs of the heart. They passed along tradition and themes in songs. And they were kind of like wandering fools with their guitars, the little minstrel instruments. And they brought joy from bringing song to whoever passed, and whoever passed would generously drop coins in their hat, and that's how they lived. And the troubadours carried the culture, carried the stories that shaped who the culture was before the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was this phase that shifted from the heart that had a balanced role, like it did in John and Linda's existence in the forest, to the patriarch taking over control and putting all the power in the logic and intellect that is predominantly a masculine trait. And these patriarchs who took over pushed the value of the heart down and out, and they did that to such an effect to where we are today, to where you have very sick, unhealthy, powerful leaders, like some of the ones that are leading our country, and you have powerless maidens who have effectively had their hands cut off, that are doing the service of maidens but not being rewarded for it because we don't value the heart anymore. Examples of that are daycare workers, teachers, homemakers, people who nurture and serve with their hands. Their value, the value of service that they offer, has been diminished, and they're not rewarded. They find themselves scraping to make a living, starving in some places, having to work several jobs. It's a real tragedy. And the patriarchs have learned to usurp their authority, which means they enact a power that they gather to themselves over Mother Nature, instead of being in communion with Mother Nature like the woodsman and Linda were, in a very simple, balanced life of respect between the masculine and the feminine, to where we are today, where the patriarchs over 100 years, 150 years or so, maybe more, have attacked the Mother Nature that we live on. And the intricate web of life that sustains us all has been injured deeply. In fact, so deeply that there is a mass extinction, which means there's a large number of living things in the world that are dying, because the intricate web of life that sustains us has not been honored, has not been nurtured by the power of the maiden. And we are at the point to where the imbalance is showing us cancer, unhealthy air, and the lung and respiratory diseases that come from that, to unsafe food and food conditions like they had in China, where this pandemic, the coronavirus, came from. It was a very unsanitary, crowded, abusive towards life environment in the way it consumed food. I won't go into details because it's really sad, what the things they would do to dogs and cats. And Mother Nature has given us a shrug. She sent all of us to our rooms, and she said, go think honestly and seriously about what we're doing to the planet. And I've been doing this. And I know what we need to do is invite the maiden back to the table of power and share and reward the service of the maiden and restore her hands. Because it is only the maidens in our community that can come and save us from our own self-destructive path. I pray the maidens will step forth and regain their power. Amen.